Let's check our latest developments now. This is a day for Americans to take time to remember the many victims of these attacks.
Also, on the investigation, Jonathan, we've just learned that a hotel room in Manila has been raided by Philippine and U.S. agents. No one has been arrested, but they did find some bomb-making residue. And also here in the United States, off the coast of Florida, the Coast Guard has detained 2 people taken off a Carnival cruise ship. They want to ask some questions. We are looking into whether this has any direct link to Tuesday's terrorist attack.
Overseas, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban say suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden was not involved in the attacks. Taliban leaders say, though, they fear American retaliatory strikes. We'll turn our attention now to the Pentagon, where a fire flared up again briefly overnight, stopping rescue work. Apparently they're back at it now. We'll get more from CNN's Mark Potter, who was at the Pentagon. Mark?
Well, Jonathan, that fire halted recovery operations for a while until firefighters could get in there and put the fire out. It took them about 25 minutes to do that, and no one was hurt, fortunately. As we can see from this live picture now, that fire is out. Recovery operations continue. However, there was a new concern being reported this morning. Officials are worried about weather reports suggesting that bad weather may come rolling in here, as it has already done in New York. And with the fragile structure there that we're looking at, there are concerns about whether the operation here would be allowed to continue. And they may have to halt it again. They'll just have to see. Right now, though, even at this early hour in the morning, those operations continue. The workers continue to dig through the rubble and to shore up the building. They're still trying to find bodies, and they're searching for the cockpit voice and data recorders, the so-called black boxes from the American Airlines 757, which crashed into the building Tuesday morning. The Pentagon says its best estimate now is that around 190 people died here Tuesday morning, including the passengers on that plane. The bodies are being taken for identification and preparation to the mortuary at the Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. Now, survivors of the attack are talking now about their experiences. Many of them have extremely dramatic stories about what happened to them when the plane hit and how they were able to escape alive.
Indeed, we were indeed working about 100 feet from what I call ground zero. I was talking to a friend, a major friend of mine in the Army, who was calling up to ask if I had heard about the World Trade Center, and of course I did. Everybody in the Pentagon did. The whole Pentagon was abuzz that morning with the video footage of that. And she jokingly told me, you know, the Pentagon is probably next. You ought to get out of there. And we sort of chuckled about that. And she said again, I'm serious, David. You really ought to get out of there. And it was at that moment that I've described it as the gates of hell opening up. The wall that was beside me just simply crumpled, much the way that you would crumple a piece of loose leaf paper. And you have a moment there to realize what is happening. And probably because she had planted the seed in my mind, I knew instantaneously what was happening. And I thought, we're under attack. And there was a brilliant flash of light which came from the corners of the wall which had given away. And immediately I was thrown about 25 feet back into the office next door. Still had the phone in my hand.
Now, later this morning, there will be prayer services here at the Pentagon in conjunction with the National Day of Prayer and Remembrance called by President Bush. In the meantime, the daily operations here at the Pentagon continue in full amid reports from Pentagon officials that President Bush is considering calling up as many as 50,000 military reservists to help, we are told, with disaster relief efforts, and also to assist National Guard pilots who have been flying combat air patrols in the Washington and New York area. They're continuing to do that, we're told. They are also on standby at 26 bases around the country. Back to you.
We've heard a great deal about how treacherous the conditions are at the World Trade Center, how dangerous the recovery work is there. The Pentagon, of course, is a much shorter building, and most of it still stands. Is it a safer environment for those who are working?
No, it's not. There are still hot spots that have to be taken into consideration. As soon as the workers opened up an area, fire officials say the air got in there and triggered a fire from one of those hot spots, and workers had to flee the area right away. Fortunately, as I said earlier, no one was hurt. This is an unstable environment, and that's why they're so concerned now about this weather coming in. We don't know yet if it'll happen, but they are worried that they might have to halt recovery operations again. We'll just have to see.
Mark Potter at the Pentagon. Thanks. Carol.
John, this is, of course, the scene from the nation's capital, and we've been to New York City, but this terrorist attack stretches from these cities all the way to rural America. It is a tragedy uniting towns big and small. As CNN senior political correspondent Candy Crowley found in Berryville, Virginia.
Berryville, Virginia is an hour's drive from the Pentagon, far enough away not to have heard terrorism's roar, close enough to feel its pain.
I spent all day yesterday at the Pentagon working the fire.
A pretty terrible scene.
Yeah, it's about as unbelievable as the TV doesn't do it any justice. It's horrible.
After 48 hours on call, D.C. firefighter Craig Hageman came home to Berryville and bought a couple of flags.
I believe in my country. I believe in everything we're about. And the more I support it, and the more everybody else will support it, and it's just keeping the faith.
Berryville's the kind of place where the barber is a minister and the mayor and his mother run the flower shop. The kind of place where putting up flags was second nature. No meetings, no proposals. It just kind of happened.
They came out late on Tuesday, and just sort of a spontaneous thing from the town office. So we decided that we have these flags that we obviously put up for Memorial Day and Labor Day and 4th of July and special occasions like that, and just thought this was a good time to put them out, just to show some support.
They are everywhere now. They hang from the mirrors of Potter's barbershop.
Well, we all love a country, and we have big pride in the country, and it's hard to tell you what patriotism is. It's got to be inside.
They decorate every table inside Jane's Lunch, a third-generation diner.
I feel helpless here in Berryville. What can I do? I can't go to New York and help those people. I can give blood. That's the extent of what I can do.
Population 3,000, Berryville is small-town America. Berryville is Mayberry, only instead of Sheriff Andy Taylor, you find Officer Anthony Roper.
It's kind of funny. I've driven around the last couple of days, and an older gentleman, retired military gentleman, been saluting me and really coming up and asking and appreciating us. And I guess this as a whole, seeing how the country's reacted to all this, the people being very patriotic.
But there is more than patriotism here. There is defiance. Just after Pearl Harbor, a Japanese admiral said, "I fear all we have done is to have awakened a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Listen now to some of the voices of Berryville.
I'm not Bush, but if I was, I'd be relocating the B-52s to Guam. We got to find out who did it.
I'm sure the President Bush is going to take care of business.
You want him to?
Hell yeah. Everybody's pissed, ain't they? Sure.
They usually sell 10 copies of the New York Times at the Berryville newsstand. Wednesday morning, they sold 80, along with every other paper they had. They talk of little else over latte and chocolate chip cookies.
First is, I can't believe it, and now there's such anger, and we better blast the hell out of somebody. Everybody's ready to flatten someone for having done this.
The sleeping giant stirs again now in a small town. Candy Crowley, CNN, Berryville, Virginia.
Regardless of whether it's a small town or a large city, many Americans will join President Bush today in a national day of prayer and remembrance of Tuesday's victims. CNN White House correspondent Major Garrett joins us now with the latest. Major?
Jonathan, indeed, the president has called for today to be a national day of prayer and remembrance, asking Americans across the country at their lunch hour to go to their place of worship and say a prayer not only for those victims in Virginia and New York, but also for the recovery and rescue efforts underway in both locations. And today, early this morning, while most of official Washington slept, the first tangible efforts that those pledges of swift bipartisan support for President Bush are in fact real. The White House and congressional negotiators reaching a deal early this morning on a $40 billion emergency supplemental bill that will provide money for New York and Virginia to clean up and recover as much as they can, and also provide President Bush the financial wherewithal he needs to prosecute a counterterrorism offensive against those found by the U.S. government responsible for the attacks in Virginia and in New York. $10 billion of that can be made immediately available by the stroke of the president's pen. Another $10 billion will be released by Congress upon notification from President Bush. Then $20 billion will be set in a contingency fund that Congress will release after consultations with President Bush. Earlier on Thursday night on Larry King Live, House Speaker Dennis Hastert explained not only the reasons behind that supplemental emergency spending bill, but also a separate piece of legislation the White House and Congress are working on, providing President Bush the legal authority to prosecute a war against terrorism.
We're working with them. We have to have this type of cooperation to make sure that both the ability to give the president the power is something that we can all agree on, and also the amount of money that we need to clean up the problems, to take care of our victims in Virginia and New York, and incidentally families that go through that whole Northeast area, and then go forward and fund the investigation and the ability to bring these terrorists to justice.
Another obligation, of course, for President Bush is to try in some small ways to soothe the grief, to some small way minimize the trauma felt by so many. He's done so here in the Washington area. On Thursday, accompanied by the First Lady Laura Bush, the first family went to George Washington Hospital Center to meet some of the victims of the plane crash at the Pentagon, consoling not only victims who were injured in the original crash, but some who were injured trying to rescue those who were injured in the original crash, and also meeting some of the doctors and nurses. The president saying afterwards he was very, very moved, not only by the suffering, but by the help and aid so many had provided those injured. The president will get a much larger dose of that experience later today when he flies to New York City, the epicenter of grief, suffering, and heroism, the center of New York, center of Manhattan, where the Twin Towers have collapsed. So many are buried, and so many others are working tirelessly to try to deal with the wreckage. Mayor Giuliani and New York's Governor George Pataki will be with the president, guiding him along both in an aerial survey and on the ground. Thursday from the Oval Office, the president talked to both Mayor Giuliani of New York and the Governor of New York, George Pataki, a Republican, saluting them on what he described as their heroic efforts to deal with this catastrophe in New York City, and pledging all the federal resources available. The president will not only bring his ability to provide emotional and spiritual sustenance to those on the ground in New York City, but also, as I mentioned, the $10 billion of immediate federal assistance and promises of more, courtesy of the action by Congress, which is expected to be approved, by the way, by the House and Senate on Friday, and the president should be able to sign that legislation on Saturday. Those are many of the realities the president is dealing with. There is yet another one here in Washington. An eerie sense of trepidation, a sense of being edgy about the security of the White House and the surrounding area. On Thursday afternoon, the Secret Service extended the security perimeter around the White House, and all this morning in the darkness, helicopter hovers above Washington, above the White House, shining its searchlight down around the compound around the White House and the surrounding areas, a signal, a sign, visible and audible, of the heightened sense of security throughout the nation's capital. You can see it now, the light, the spotlight from the helicopter piercing the early morning darkness, just on watch. It's not a sense of panic in any stretch here in Washington, but very, very much a sense of precaution. Jonathan.
Major, the president will be traveling to mark this day of prayer and remembrance. He was traveling, of course, on Tuesday when he and we learned of this enormous disaster. You were with the president then. Can you tell us about those first stunning moments?
It was amazing. The thing that strikes me most, Jonathan, is that there is always a sense people have about the President of the United States, any President of the United States, and those who work for him, that they're always on top of everything, that they know what's happening in any given situation at any given moment. And I can tell you, never before have I learned that that's not true than that morning. The president went for an early morning jog in Sarasota, Florida, enjoyed it very much, joked with reporters afterwards about how good he felt, how brisk it was. He came to an elementary school in Sarasota, Emma E. Booker Elementary School. The agenda, reading to some students and then talking about education reform. And then all of that agenda, all of that very gentle, sort of low-level domestic agenda building was shattered by a phone call from his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, informing him of the first jetliner that had crashed into the World Trade Center tower. The president soldiered on, went on with an event to read a book to some of the children who were sitting at his very feet. As he was doing so, his chief of staff, Andrew Card, came in, gave him the grisly news that a second jetliner had crashed into the other tower, the World Trade Center. Then the president hastily got up from that, made an announcement to the country that an apparent act of terrorism had been committed in New York City. Then the shocking, almost paralyzing news that the Pentagon had been hit by yet another jetliner.